Hello, everybody, and welcome to the El Toro Nation podcast. This is the editor-in-chief of El Toro Nation, Jake Null here. Today we're going to be talking the top 10 pro wrestlers of all time. Now, the wrestling internet community, needless to say, is one of the most vocal and hateful / loving groups you could possibly find. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody thinks their opinion's the most, and they think they know it all. And this list is going to be controversial, but it's my opinion. And I'm going to read off a few honorable mentions before I get started. I'm going to start from 10 and work my way down to 1. And this honorable mentions list could easily be in anybody's top 10. And it's not a slight to the guys. They just didn't crack my top 10. Guys like Ricky Steamboat, the late, great Eddie Guerrero, again, the late, great Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, Andre the Giant, Chris Jericho, John Cena, Sting, Roddy Piper, Edge, and Triple H. All make my list as honorable mentions. These guys have done amazing things. Again, just my opinion, they're not just cutting the mustard for this apparent list. We're going to start off at number 10 with who I think, in my opinion, is the best all-around worker on the entire list, and that is Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle is the best natural wrestler I have ever seen in my lifetime. The guy came in late 1999 and within a year was world champion. Needless to say, we all know 1996 Olympic gold medalist. This guy picked it up right off the bat and hit the ground running. Never seen anybody like that just started and just had it. And Kurt had it. And the more time he spent, he developed comedic chops. And he really learned how to cut a good promo. And that is what I'm incorporating in this list, by the way. It's going to be not just who was a great worker, but who could talk, who could sell, who put butts in the seats, longevity, all those things. This is an all-around list. So Kurt Angle, definitely number 10. Definitely belongs to be in the top 10. One of the greatest I've ever seen. Now, I omitted Roddy Piper and put him in as an honorable mention. A guy that had more charisma than him, in my opinion, belongs on that list. The recently passed away, late, great American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. The man had more charisma than anybody that's ever been in this business. He started out, as the son of a plumber. And he was truly the American Dream. It wasn't a gimmick. It really was Dusty. And in the 70s, especially with his tag team partner Dick Murdoch, was a great tag team. When he broke out on his own in Florida in the 70s, just blew up and became a huge star down there. Became NWA champion and really took off. And his work behind the scenes as well cannot go unnoticed. One of the great minds this business has ever had and truly will be missed. Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, at number 9. At 8, we have one of my all-time favorites, the Macho Man Randy Savage. Yeah. What can you say about this guy? One of the all-time greatest. Had the charisma. He had kind of this loose kind of craziness about him that was just attractive. It drew you to him on the television. Randy had a very interesting way of cutting a promo. He did it in sound bites, but it's like he danced around the sound bite with elaboration. It was a truly unique way of delivering a promo. And needless to say, everybody knows that distinct voice that everybody tries to imitate just like I did. Great run in the 80s in WWE. And then in the mid-90s, his run in WCW can't be ignored either. He went there, did some things. Won the WCW title a few times. I will admit, towards the end of his career, I thought it got a little silly there. Some of the NWO stuff was silly. But hands down, his feud in 1997 with Diamond Dallas Page was off the hook. Randy, I think in a way, reinvented himself and showed he was still one of the best workers in the business. Randy, we miss him. I think we could use a guy like him around today, just his mind. And he's truly missed, the late, great Randy Macho Man Savage. Number 8 definitely belongs there. At number 7, this might be one that will be a little shocking because a lot of people would think he'd be very high up there. Randy Savage's rival for all those years, the immortal Hulk Hogan. Hulk was not the best in-ring worker. That's why I have him down this list a little bit. But he absolutely belongs on the list because of the impact he had. I'm not saying he was a jobber. He wasn't a horrible worker, but he wasn't your Kurt Angle, Randy Savage type workers. But he drew more eyes to the product at that time than you could possibly imagine. Had all the charisma in the world. Cut a good promo. And he put butts in the seats like you can't even imagine. I'm 31 years old now. I remember all that kind of stuff about Hulk Hogan. And I remember I had the t-shirts, I had the alarm clock, I had it all. I was a Hulkamaniac. And everybody was a Hulkamaniac. And his contributions go without saying. He saved wrestling in the 80s. And guys coming up on this list took what he started and took it into another stratosphere in the 90s. Hulk Hogan, number 7. That being said, one of those guys that did that in the 90s was The Undertaker, the Phenom. Deadman comes in at number 6, is, as Jim Ross said, he was the conscience of the WWE, and still is to this day. The man is a legend, and his contributions cannot go without being acknowledged. Long tenured, behind the scenes, was told to be the locker room leader. And his work cannot be ignored. The man had classic matches. In my opinion, the greatest match I've ever seen with him and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 25. Undertaker is the best gimmick of all time. If you wrote on paper that you were to be a dead person when he started in 1991 and to see what it evolved to, nobody had a gimmick like that, and nobody has ever had a gimmick like that, and to this day, nobody has a gimmick like that. Undertaker, number 6, easy choice. Same era, number 5, I'm going with my personal favorite, The Rock, at number 5. Maybe Dusty Rhodes and Roddy Piper have a little bit more charisma. The Rock is not too far behind them. And I have always said, I think The Rock sold the moves of the opponents better than anybody else I've ever seen. Watch when Stone Cold Steve Austin would give The Rock a stunner. The Rock would bounce halfway across the ring. He just had a way of making everything look so good. And The Rock was a great worker, too. I think people underestimated and undervalued how good of a wrestler he was. And needless to say, the eyebrow, the good looks, the best promos of that era all come from my man, the Brahma Bull. He was the most mainstream star that came out of that. A name that you're probably guessing on this list people viewed as a bigger star as wrestling in that instance, but as we've seen now, what he's done afterwards, The Rock is a mainstream star. People that have never watched wrestling know who The Rock is. And I guess going back to number 7, people could say the same thing for Hulk Hogan. Those guys broke out of just the wrestling box and made it huge and made it as mainstream stars. The Rock, number 5, like I said, my all-time personal favorite. He's the man. Number 4, my favorite as a kid, was Bret the Hitman Hart, and he will always have a soft place in my heart. Bret Hart comes in at number 4. The excellence of execution. Bret was dealt a bad hand because when he rose to fame and was WWE champion around 1992, the business was on the downcline. And it wasn't Bret's fault. There wasn't anything Bret could do at that time. But he held that title with class and dignity, and he gave you the best match every single night from that 1992 to about 1995, I'll say, in that era of the WWF at the time. Bret was the best, and Bret was a hero to kids like me who we got over the Hulk Hogan thing and we needed a new hero, and Bret was that hero. He was the consummate good guy, and he gave it his all, but at the same time, he was a wrestler. And I just remember being fascinated by how he would do his moves, and we all loved the sharpshooter. In my opinion, one of the greatest finish moves of all time. And he had just classic battles with guys that, in my opinion, weren't great workers. He had to deal with your Kevin Nash's at the time, well, Diesel at the time, who was a star, don't get me wrong, but they weren't great workers. And Bret had to put his title on the line against a lot of guys. Yokozuna aside, Yoko was a great worker, but Bret had to wrestle a lot of big guys who weren't great workers, and he always made the match 5-star. He would carry the other guy. So Bret Hart, one of the greatest of all time, I think sometimes is underappreciated for how great he really was. And needless to say, the Montreal Screwjob, it's all well documented. I loved that 1996 to 1997 Bret Hart in the WWF. That was, in my opinion, his best stuff. And WCW botched it when he came over there. They had a golden opportunity to make him the biggest star in wrestling, and they botched it. But that was what WCW did. Bret Hart, number 4. Transition to number 3, another guy WCW botched, and ultimately he is one of the main reasons they went out of business. I'm talking about the Texas Rattlesnake. Stone Cold Steve Austin comes in at number 3. A lot of people would have him at number 1. I can't argue with you. The 2 guys I have ahead of you, I'll make valid arguments for, though. Steve Austin is the biggest star the WWF/WWE has ever had. He hit in late 1997, early 1998, and when he won the WWF title from Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania, the biggest star in wrestling was born. I mean, people can trace it back to 1996 King of the Ring or mid-1997 where he had the classic match with Bret Hart, which is in my top 5 all-time favorite matches. All that built to that moment where he defeated Shawn Michaels, became the champion, and the WWF took off after that. I remember vividly, I was around 14 years old at the time. Everybody, and I'm not joking, everybody had an Austin 316 t-shirt. And if they didn't have that, they had a DX shirt, or if they're WCW fans, they had an NWO shirt. Those were the 3 shirts everybody had in the late 90s. Steve Austin was the biggest star. Now, I mentioned The Rock earlier being a bigger mainstream star. Steve Austin was still in the confines of pro wrestling. He did break out a little bit. I remember him doing Celebrity Deathmatch, little spot shots like on talk shows. He was on all the late night talk shows. But The Rock had a little bit more mainstream where, you know, a mother who, like, let's just say a single adult, for instance, who never watched wrestling, doesn't have kids that watch wrestling, they knew who The Rock was because he was, you know, hosted Saturday Night Live and he went on to do movies. Some people won't know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is, but a vast majority of them do, and he was, in the context of wrestling, a bigger star than The Rock, so that's why I have him ahead. And Austin, again, great worker, very underrated wrestler. Going back to his WCW days as Stunning Steve Austin, when he was young, he worked at a little quicker pace, and even early WWF ringmaster gimmick was weird. It didn't really work, but you understood his work as a mechanic in the ring. And once they let Steve be himself, man, he just jumped in that rocket ship and took wrestling at that time to places they didn't even think were possible. The pay-per-view buy rates, the merchandise buy rates. Stone Cold Steve Austin was everywhere. and to this day has millions of listeners on his podcast because he carries that much influence. The Texas Rattlesnake, Stone Cold Steve Austin, number 3. All right, down to the final 2. I have a feeling most of you know who these 2 are, but we'll start at number 2. Drum roll, please. No, I'm just kidding. Nature Boy Ric Flair comes in at number 2. I mean, he's Ric Flair. There's not really much I could say about the Nature Boy. 16-time world champion. He took the South in the 80s mainly by storm. In the North, WWF had their own territory that went national, but the regional territory of the Carolinas into the South and going into the Midwest in the St. Louis area, Ric Flair was the man. It was Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair through the 80s. One with WWF, one with the NWA, and later became WCW. What can you say about Ric Flair? He was the consummate realization of his character. Ric Flair really was Ric Flair. The limousine riding, jet flying, wheeling dealing, kiss stealing son of a gun. That's who he was. It wasn't a show. He really did spend all that money on that stuff. And he believed it. He believed he was that person, and he turned into that person. And because he did, it came through the television screen as completely real, and the people bought it. They knew he was the Nature Boy. He'd go anywhere back in the day, and just the parties you couldn't even imagine. I've heard the stories of Flair parties, and needless to say, the Four Horsemen, which is the greatest faction of all time. I mean, I grew up, in my heyday with DX and, the Hart Foundation and the NWO, that kind of stuff. But the Four Horsemen were the innovators. They were the best. They just made it where they were the first bad guys that were cool. And wrestling changed in the years to come where people actually cheered for the bad guys. But it was to the point where they booed the Four Horsemen, but they respected them. And a lot of that had to do with Nature Boy Ric Flair. They knew he was the man, as he proclaimed it. And his meaning to this business is everything. And to this day, anybody that's a wrestling fan knows Nature Boy Ric Flair, idolizes Nature Boy Ric Flair, and knows he is the man. Well, last but not least, we are at number 1. But to go back over the top 10 real quick, Kurt Angle, number 10. American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, number 9. Macho Man, Randy Savage at 8. Immortal Hulk Hogan at 7. The Undertaker, number 6. The Rock, number 5. Bret the Hitman Hart, number 4. Stone Cold Steve Austin, number 3. Nature Boy Ric Flair, number 2. And number 1, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. He is by far the best in-ring competitor I have ever seen. Shawn Michaels did things you can't even begin to imagine. He was able to tell a story with his body and his facial expressions better than anybody in the wrestling business I've ever seen. And as much as everybody thinks the Stone Cold Stunner might be the greatest finishing move of all time, kids used to do the Macho Man Randy Savage elbow drop. I've always stated I think the Shawn Michaels Sweet Chin Music / the super kick is the most iconic finishing move of all time. You could just see it, just tuning up the band in the corner with the tap, and he would just hit that kick at him anywhere, and it made the crowd pop every single time. Shawn Michaels was the best. Shawn Michaels, I can arguably, has had at least half of maybe the 10 best matches I've ever seen. He put his livelihood and body on the line every single time he was in that ring. And he cut an amazing promo, especially after he won his first title in '96. It wasn't like kind of the passing of the torch from Bret Hart to Shawn Michaels in that time period for Shawn to be the next guy. After that, when maybe Shawn had an injury and came back pretty strong in '97, came back as a new Shawn Michaels. And that's where D-Generation X was born. He hooked up with Triple H in China, ravishing Rick Rude. That Shawn Michaels is well documented. His personal life was in peril. But that character was fascinating to watch on television every week. He didn't care. And as somebody that has a problem with authority himself, I identified with HBK because he didn't care what the established order had to say. It was anarchy. And he was pissed off. He was angry. But you know what? He got in that ring and backed it up every single time. And needless to say, like I said earlier, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, WrestleMania 25, best match I've ever seen. Nobody has ever told a story, in my eyes, like those two did on that night. And as great as The Undertaker is, in my opinion, it was on the back of Shawn Michaels. He is that good. He is the showstopper, which in my opinion is the greatest nickname anybody has ever gotten. You can make the argument for Ric Flair with his nicknames, but Shawn Michaels was the showstopper. You ask a lot of young wrestlers today, they will tell you Shawn Michaels is their inspiration. And my opinion, Shawn Michaels is the greatest of all time. Well, that concludes this list of the 10 greatest professional wrestlers of all time. I threw in some honorable mentions there for you. Needless to say, like I said, this is my opinion. Not gonna lie, I mean, of course I did some research looking into some things, but I just looked at these guys on a one-on-one basis and how it hit me. Because it is my opinion. It's not necessarily who sold the most tickets, but I included all that into it and came up with a list that I think is fair. Your list may be completely different if you had one, but this is mine. So I appreciate you listening, and this is Jake Null from El Toro Nation signing off.